attractiveness and competence. People who are physically attractive are often perceived as more intelligent, talented, or trustworthy, even if there's no evidence to support these assumptions. And of course, attractiveness can be perceived differently based on which race you belong to, believe it or not. As unfair as that is. Workplace evaluations. A manager might view an employee who performs well in one task as a higher performer overall. Now, in the military, there's a ton of subjective evaluations. Let's say you're a commander of a 130-man unit. There's 1,000 things that can evaluate your unit on. But you individually, as a commander, there's a couple of things that you're going to be judged on. So what people do is they're very careful with their appearance, extremely careful. The best officers often have a similar appearance. They're tall, they're relatively thin, they're in good shape. And what I used to do was I would make sure I obliterated the physical fitness test because it was an objective evaluation point. So I had to make sure that I influenced that one thing. And what you would find is that officers who get high physical fitness scores often are rated well elsewhere. And there's not really a good reason for that because, it's just not. But this is how I use the halo effect to my advantage. Okay. So reverse halo effect. This is when the opposite happens. If you have a thick Southern accent, people might assume you're stupid or you're a horrible racist. If you have a distinctly black dialect, people might assume that you're uneducated or that you have criminal leanings or you're dishonest. The horn effect is why your mom told you to leave the house well dressed and present yourself well, because if you make a poor impression on somebody, they will carry that over into other things. All right. And it'll be very hard to persuade them otherwise. But most obviously, the horn effect is basically the story of life as a black male. OK, black males don't have a good reputation. If you're a black male and you haven't accepted that yet, I don't know where you've been. All right. That's just how it is. I know it. I have a black son. I have a black father, black grandfather, black brothers. Black people don't have a good reputation. I know this. All right. So this is working against you. In fact, even the Delta airline pilot who flew my plane as I was finishing the script was a black male. I had actually never observed a black male flying my plane before. So I actually took some footage of him. My wife ran up and gave him a hug and said, "Oh, my God, that's so wonderful. You didn't crash our plane." No, I'm joking. She just ran up and said she thought it was wonderful that he flew our plane. In fact, he was called in last minute because the pilot who was going to fly got sick. So they called him in from Atlanta and he flew our plane. All right. So ChatGPT even has an explanation for why this stuff happens, why the halo effect is a thing. All right. They say it arises from our brain's tendency to simplify decision making by relying on heuristics. Once we form an overall impression, we subconsciously apply it to other judgments, reducing cognitive effort. So it's laziness. People are being lazy out here, man. Now, it says they got some strategies. One is awareness. Now, this is what I've been trying to do for 12 years, ever since I had my horrible experience getting my residency destroyed. And I realized what was happening as it was happening, and I tried my best to communicate what was happening to the people who were doing it. Now, they were not willing to listen. They believed that I was just making excuses as a person who was incompetent. So my goal for the last 12 years has been to spread awareness as best I can. And that's what my first video was. It was me spreading awareness to the leaders in the U.S. Army Medical Corps so they could make sure they didn't have a part in doing it to someone behind me. So me and ChatGPT are perfectly aligned right here. 2, objective criteria. Now, I knew this too because I had been reading, like, while this was happening to me, I was reading, like, why is this happening? And I had determined that it was the objective criteria. It was the fact that no one was using objective criteria. They were just writing things down months after the fact. Well, I remember Jones got this one thing wrong. That's one time. So, that's my impression of him. They would write this in my evals. And I was like, whoa. You guys aren't evaluating me frequently enough or objectively enough. I need you to be more objective in the way you evaluate me. And so I had begged them to do that. And they did. I always give my residency program director credit for that. If he's watching, Dr. O, I know what you did. And I respected it. However, when it came time to throw me out of residency, they set aside the objective criteria, which had demonstrated that I did indeed know what I was doing. And they just said, let's take a vote. So here it is. Objective criteria is the best way to fix the bias, and it was not used. Seek multiple perspectives. Now this, unfortunately, in the setting where I found myself, wasn't really possible. Everyone was sort of group thinking together. They didn't get multiple perspectives. I think multiple perspectives would have been somebody reaching outside of the department and saying maybe, hey, look, I have a black doctor friend who I went to residency with. Let me call him and ask him if he thinks we're wrong, or consulting something like that. But nobody did anything like that. And then, of course, separate traits. Now, this is great advice in GME, graduate medical education. That's the system through which we're evaluated as doctors while we're coming up. They actually do come up with these separate traits to evaluate, but they're sort of an afterthought. You're not really evaluated on them on a daily basis. What happens is they just fill out an evaluation of these traits after the fact. They often don't state any objective evidence. They just say what they think, so that even though they're separating traits, the process is still heavily biased, to say the least. Now, so that's halo effect and reverse halo effect. Now, another one of these glitches is the in-group, out-group bias. ChatGPT has the following to say about that. This is the tendency to favor members of their own group, the in-group, over those of the other group, the out-group. This bias can manifest in various ways, such as preferential treatment, positive perceptions, or greater empathy towards in-group members, while displaying suspicion, hostility, or negative stereotyping towards out-group members. A lot of times, this is what we're talking about when people complain about police violence. The police see us as other, as out-group, and so this is what's taking effect. They may not be full-blown bigots, racists, but it's the in-group, out-group bias. So in-group favoritism. This is where people tend to view their own group more positively. Members of the in-group are often seen as more trustworthy, competent, likable. Out-group derogation. Members of the out-groups are stereotyped, excluded, treated unfairly. Negative traits may be more readily attributed to out-group members. The psychological basis, this is thought to stem from evolutionary mechanisms for group survival. It helps build group cohesion and identity, but it can lead to conflict with other groups. This is classic with sports teams, right? Everybody's wearing the same jersey. Yeah, we're the Eagles. We're the Eagles. Everybody's rah, rah, rah. And then somebody from the Ravens walks by and someone throws a beer at them or something. And everyone cheers because they're bonding by opposing someone else. This is how we work. We're rather simple as humans. We're little war machines. We band together and we expel the invader. The more tightly we bind together, the more effectively we repel the invader. Dismissing and destroying the outsider helps us to bond. Many black doctors and professionals have told me they describe this very effect. In fact, I experienced this effect, which I'll probably go to in another video, but essentially, I can admit this now. I bugged their room one time. And I bugged their room the night before. They said they were going to go over our performance reviews with us face to face. I slid a voice activated recorder into a book on a bookshelf, put it on the bookshelf, and walked away. Came back 24 hours later. I had everything they said on the recorder. I expected them to say, this dude is an N-word and drop all these horrible things, but they didn't. Instead, what I heard was people trying to one-up each other with how horrible Joe Jones was. They were twisting and distorting conversations we'd had, and they were almost trying to see who could tell the best story. They were bonding, I could tell. They were all bonding over how horrible I was. They were sticking together to expel the invader. Statute of limitations is up on that. That's the only reason I told you that, because that wasn't legal at all. So now you can see how easily this could apply to a person of a different race in the workplace, like as I just explained. The thing that one must understand is that this is how humans are wired. It's not a white thing. It's not a black thing. It is a human thing. We are wired to dominate other groups. And as soon as a dominant group encounters a less dominant group, they will subject the members of that group to these behaviors. I think that it's interesting to note that as a black man who grew up in a mostly white environment, I always had very positive experiences with a wide range of white people. But when I stepped into spaces as the only black person who was doing something mostly considered the domain of white men, so when I stepped into an environment where I was the black infantry officer, most infantry officers are white men, or I was an orthopedic surgery resident, most orthopedic surgery residents and orthopedic surgeons are white men. I was an instant outgroup, and I experienced these kind of events on a daily basis. Now, just to explore the idea further, I actually searched the term outgroup double standard, which is what I consider the third major glitch. I was surprised to see that that is actually the exact term used to describe the phenomenon I experienced. And I thought it was very weird that I had tried to explain my experience to so many different people. And yet, here was a simple phrase, outgroup double standard. Well, I guess it's a noun, really, that I had searched for all this time, and here it was. This is the Black work experience, outgroup double standard. I was very upset that this word had escaped me while I was going through my experience, that I couldn't fully explain it to anyone, and that this one word would have done it all. But nonetheless, at least I have it now, and you have it now. So this is a very human phenomenon. In fact, they've done studies where they've shown the degree to which outgroup double standard occurs in a group of people who are evaluating, I think it was baseball. And they were seeing if this was your team and it was clearly a wrong call, but you ignored it, how often did that happen? And they've characterized it. This is how badly humans exhibit outgroup double standards. So the key features, leniency towards the in-group. Members of the in-group are often given the benefit of the doubt for mistakes or poor behavior. Negative actions by in-group members are attributed to external factors. He just had a bad day. He's just getting warmed up. Stricter standards for the outgroup. Members of the outgroup are judged more harshly for the same actions. And negative behaviors are attributed to internal traits. They're irresponsible. They're incompetent. They're not smart. You see this in politics constantly. In fact, the entire political campaign leading up to our last election is literally Republicans and Democrats applying outgroup double standards to one another. That's the game, essentially. So moral and ethical judgments. In-group members are perceived as more morally justified in their actions. Similar actions by out-group members are seen as unethical or unjustified. Just watch American politics for some examples. That's what I wrote in my notes here. So you can see this is a human condition. Humans are always going to fight. This is what we do. We have to understand why we're fighting to stop. So successes of in-group members are celebrated as deserved, and successes of out-group members may be dismissed as luck or external help. You'll see this all the time when you see a black person who's in a job. Everybody be like, DEI hire. Doesn't matter how smart he is. Must be here because of DEI. Let's say a white pilot crashes a plane. He didn't crash that plane because of DEI. Must have been something wrong with the plane. Now, social identity theory. People derive part of their self-esteem for their group memberships, leading them to protect and favor their group. Confirmation bias. Individuals selectively focus on information that confirms their positive beliefs about the in-group and negative beliefs about the out-group. Cognitive dissonance. Double standards help resolve dissonance by allowing people to maintain a positive view of their group even when evidence contradicts it. All that to say, overcoming group double standard bias. Awareness, awareness, awareness. Again, that's what I've been doing for 12 years. Empathy. Now, my experience with being on the receiving end of this outgroup double standard did, in fact, have the effect of growing my empathy significantly. When you experience this outgroup double standard, here's the crazy thing. You're the only one who can see it. But the way reality works is what everyone can see. So you're experiencing something, but you're the only one who can see it, and everyone else sees it differently. So it's like you're living in your own universe where you're being tormented. It's a very difficult experience. All right. Now, as a result of experiencing this, having everyone turn against me, have everyone treat me poorly, and then essentially take what I had valued most at that time, it did develop my empathy by several orders of magnitude. I became a significantly better person and a significantly better doctor as a result of being tortured like this. Now, I would not ever wish this on anyone. I would never wish that someone would experience what I experienced. But I would hope, I think the world would be better if everyone experienced something that took them just short of breaking them. An experience like mine, where they were all alone, where everyone's ganging up on them, everyone's misperceiving their intentions, and no one's giving them any wiggle room and coming down on them hard and talking about them behind their backs and sabotaging them. If everyone could experience that to a degree that they could tolerate, I think the world would be better. We would all come out on the other side more caring, more empathetic. And, you know, overall, yes, empathy. Empathy is the answer to most things. If most humans really took a little bit of time to try to empathize with their fellow man, I think we would all just be a little bit better off. Now, objective criteria. Once again, during my experience, I identified the fact that people were not using objective criteria. And that is the answer to overcoming bias. Diverse interactions, that's not always going to be possible in the settings that I kept finding myself in. So lastly, the last of these glitches is group psychology. Group psychology compared to individual psychology can have a lot of negative effects. So one is conformity and loss of individual autonomy. So even if you find that there are people who recognize that you're being treated unfairly in the group, it is possible that they will be unlikely to speak up in fear of the consequences. Now, this actually happened with my case. So when I was terminated from my orthopedic surgery residency in 2012, there was a man in the room. He was one of the people who would vote on it. And he told me later, years later, that he knew what was happening, but he was afraid to speak up. Now, he eventually rose to the level of U.S. Army Graduate Medical Education Chief. So he's the head of all residencies all over the U.S. Army now. And he said that part of his reason for doing that was because of what he witnessed that day. He apologized to me for not being strong enough to be different, to speak up. He even told General Crossland, the 3-star general who changed the rules after my first video. He told her that this happened. And he is the man who's responsible for letting me give the presentation that day that was part of my first video. So I would say that he more than redeemed himself. But he is an example of how groupthink, how resisting, people sometimes don't want to stand against the group. And so they'll let bad things happen. Groups prioritize harmony and consensus above critical evaluation. It's easier to agree that this one resident over here, this black boy, is just not good at his job. He's a bad doctor, rather than speaking up and saying, maybe we all have a problem. Maybe we are all subjecting him to unfair bias. This motivates people to remain blind to the group's mistreatment of anyone. I used to always say, listen, what are they going to do? Tear up the whole system? Question everything every single time because one captain says he's being mistreated and maybe he even is? Or do they just fire that captain and move on? Which one takes less energy? Status quo will always take less energy. And so that's what group think or the group effect encourages. Now, all these things come together. So in-group, out-group bias, halo effect, out-group double standard, and then group think. They all come together. They merge together to create what I like to call the Tripler Special. Now, I'm going to play the Tripler Special for you, okay? This is from my second video. This is the experience of the African American in the workplace. I'm going to call it Getting a Tripler Special, okay? So you're going to hear me mention that a few times. A Tripler Special, all right? Now, so it's not as simple, but it would seem that all black people are experiencing this. And then I'm going to use these black and white balls to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So a lone black person walks into a new workplace. One person has a strong bias and a belief that this person is not capable of doing the job. Or maybe several people have a mild bias that this person isn't smart enough or hardworking enough. Or they just like him less because he's other. The coworkers and evaluators, they proceed to see what they expect to see over the coming months, weeks, and years. They don't see what they don't expect to see, which is a strong performer. Any mistake that they make just reinforces the bias that already exists. This is the racism part. This is the bias part. This is confirmation bias of a racial nature. Okay, now, this is where the tribalism steps in. These white marbles talk among themselves a lot more often than they talk to this black marble. They are more likely to be friends. They are more likely to share opinions. They are more likely to back each other up. They exclude this black ball more and more often. And they generally agree that this is reasonable because the black ball just isn't that good or he isn't a good worker. And any of these white marbles that haven't observed or didn't have a bias, well, they're going to develop a bias based on the conversations with these other marbles. So now you have an entire group of people who share a bias based on one person having a bias. Tribalism has transmitted that bias to all of these white marbles. And although no one is a true certified bigot, although they're out there, everyone has turned on this person. And see, now eventually they give him feedback directly. Eventually. Or they suggest that he's just not that good. He starts to get angry and protest. And now, in addition to believing he's a bad performer, they see him as angry and difficult. He goes to the boss, the higher up. He considers the boss reasonable and good. The boss listens, says he'll talk with the team, all the members of his tribe. But when he talks with the team, unsurprisingly, he trusts them. He accepts their accounts as true and accurate. After all, why would they lie? This is one of the biggest, hardest things to deal with, is that a lot of white people will look to other white people and say, well, why would they lie? And then a black person would be thinking to themselves, why wouldn't they lie? Eventually, this black marble has to go. And he leaves knowing that he could have done the job. He was taken out for no other reason than he was different. Now, this process I just described, hundreds of black folks in the comments said they have lived this. But they simply couldn't prove it. And who would they prove it to anyway? Now, here's another video that I found while scrolling through Instagram. And this is a white man who has observed this dynamic for decades. He had something to say.
Professional life, I've observed 5 ways that white people alienate black people in the office. My name's Curious Ben. I'm your caucasity coach. Let me explain. 1, they accidentally leave them out of emails. I've seen this happen so many times, this sociopathic type of accident that allows white people to have the upper hand on information that they share with each other while not including their black co-workers. Number 2, they develop leadership teams that don't include any black people. If your leadership team doesn't include any black people, how are you truly going to represent all your employees with your leadership vision and communication? Number 3, they create cliques that don't include any of their black co-workers, and then have the goddamn caucasity to say, why do all the black people eat together? Number 4, they hire and promote people that they're comfortable with, people with similar communication styles, and this means either white people or black people who are able to navigate whiteness without upsetting the white people's comfort. And number 5, they create such a toxic environment for black employees that black employees quit and move on. So white people, if you're really serious about creating workplaces that represent the communities you live in, you're going to have to tackle these 5 ways that you're currently alienating black people in the workplace. I hope this helps. Stay compassionate. All
right, so there you have it. These are the dynamics at play in everyday America in the workplace. Every single black person in America will co-sign this, without a doubt. Every black person who has worked in an environment where they are outnumbered will tell you that this is how it works. You will not find a single black person who tells you this is not how it works. I can tell you that, okay? After my first video, I received thousands of comments, emails, messages, people thanking me for telling the story. They were just thanking me. They were thankful that someone had managed to capture this elusive phenomenon. That was it. They just wanted to say thank you. This is our modern story as African Americans. We're not going to be beaten in the streets. We're not going to be chased down like dogs. We're not going to be told to drink out of a different water fountain. This is our experience. We're going to try to enter the higher economy or any economy. We're going to try to work side by side with our white brethren, and then this is going to happen. Now, I'm of the opinion that you can't really legislate good humanity. We tried that with the Civil Rights Act, and it took decades of lawsuits, boycotts, publicity campaigns to change. If you look at minimum wage laws, that's people trying to legislate good humanity. Pay people enough money to live. Pay people, you super rich people, give people more money. Okay? And what do? They found out they had to tell people you can't pay them any less than this, and then people actually pay them that little. That's what happens when you try to legislate good behavior. What it is we have to find a way to cultivate good humanity in people for the sake of being good humans. In a lot of ways, I think that's kind of what culture is supposed to do. A successful culture encourages people to be good to other people. And we just have to get that into our, our modern culture. So all that stuff I'm saying about legislating good behavior and good humanity is that you can't let DEI overreach. What DEI attempted to do was set quotas in some places, and not in the Army. They didn't do that. They try to dictate hiring and promotion practices, say, hey, you have to have this number of black people here. You have to have this number of black people there. Like, don't do that. Like, just let it happen. I think we're past the point where no black person is going to get hired. I think that we just let the people get hired who are going to get hired. But once they're hired, let's be fair. Let's actually give them an environment where they can perform. Okay, so what I want for DEI and what I want for a DEI equivalent program, DEI is obviously going away. But what I believe is that DEI should never have existed. What should have happened is human resources departments, the people responsible for hiring, firing, promoting, and evaluating, or at least holding the evaluations, they should have been better at their job. As a human resources department, your job is to objectively evaluate your human resources and take stock of what is present. We need to establish more elaborate methods for objectively evaluating every single job position in existence if we're going to truly be fair. If you're washing windows or doing surgery, we need to have objective criteria establishing what your exact performance actually is. Some black people talk about keeping receipts in the workplace. I have a doctor friend who told me he did exactly that. He kept records on every doctor's mortality rate in the operating room so that when they would come for him, he would be able to say, you know, my mortality rate is actually the lowest. And he kept a whole bunch of other stats too. And it actually happened, and he actually presented it, and it actually got him out of a situation where people were trying to gang up on him. I mean, that's surgery, but I mean, even if you're washing windows, what percentage of days do you arrive on time at work? How many windows do you actually clean in a day? What percentage of windows need to be done again? How often do you drop a bucket, from the 30th floor onto the people down in the street? How many windows are terrible? And then how well are you maintaining your equipment and putting your equipment away? Something like that. That sounds extreme. It sounds very extreme. But this is the only way to be fair and to be objective. We have to give as much true information about an individual and about a number of individuals that they're going to be compared to in order to actually be fair. So create an evaluation system and a promotion system that heavily relies on objective performance data. Now, everybody knows, or they should know, whenever people comment that why don't we have DEI in football and basketball, I will always point out, oh, we did that already. Don't you remember? Black people were banned from baseball, basketball, and football at different times. That was the DEI. People didn't like it, though. And then as shows like ESPN, SportsCenter started to blow up, everything is based on objective criteria. How many yards did you run? How many touchdowns? What's your completion rate? Everybody knows about the stats. The stats are objective performance information. So do that for everybody, everywhere. Create a legitimate, unbiased, and effective grievance process for when the objective criteria do not match the promotion or do not match the termination. That's it. The current grievance process asks an individual suffering through the phenomenon. So in my experience, the grievance process was basically, I was telling everyone, hey, look, there's something bad happening. I'm not being treated fairly. So what did they do? They went to the group to ask, well, what's actually happening? And they took statements from the in-group, essentially asking, is this out-group member being mistreated? So if you ask a bunch of in-group members if they are doing something unfair or unethical to a member of the out-group, what do you think they're going to say? And then once they say what you would expect, the investigation concludes, well, nothing happened here. You see, that's not how you do it. You have to come up with objective criteria and compare the objective criteria to the outcomes. And that's it. I really don't think it comes down to anything more than that. So, if I were king of the world, that would be all DEI really was. Lastly, I would say a DEI that focuses on the historical oppression of black people is not really needed to explain this. Sometimes people complain that DEI makes you hate your country and pits us against one another. Well, I don't think you necessarily need to do that. But I think you can probably emphasize that groups will be against each other. DEI isn't responsible. It's just like on the White House website, he says, well, DEI divides us by race. No, Americans divide Americans by race. DEI is just pointing it out and trying to do something about it. But this is human behavior. It happens all over the world. The British dominated the Irish and the Scottish. They degraded and insulted them for centuries. In fact, when the Irish arrived in America, they weren't considered full white people, nor were the Italians. But in the past 80 years or so, they kind of have gotten that promotion to just white people. Like, you know, the average person doesn't seem to distinguish between Italian, Irish, British, Swedish, whatever. We don't care. All right. But here's the crazy part. In Ireland, the Irish Catholics heavily discriminate against the Irish Protestants, so much so that there are affirmative action programs in Ireland to make sure that Protestants can get hired and promoted and not fired unreasonably. Affirmative action for Irish Protestants. The Japanese, they're generally thought to be a single ethnicity, but that is not true. The Japanese that we know and love are called the Yamamoto. That's one ethnicity. The Ainu, they are another group of Japanese. They primarily were living in sort of like, I don't want to call it primitive, but their culture was like tribal, rural. They lived in huts. They didn't use a lot of technology, but the Yamamoto Japanese tried their best to wipe them out, to eliminate their language, eliminate their culture. Same in China. There's multiple ethnicities. The Han Chinese are the group that most Americans are familiar with. And then the Uyghurs are subjected to absolutely horrific mistreatment.